On the podcast today, we're going to speak about chapter 68 of the Tao Te Ching, which makes up the 68th episode of the 81 meditations on the Tao Te Ching. And as usual, Guyang will read Jia Fu Feng and Jane English's translation, and I will read Derek Lin's translation.
A good soldier is not violent. A good fighter is not angry. A good winner is not vengeful. A good employer is humble. This is known as the virtue of not striving. This is known as the ability to deal with people. This since ancient times has been known as the ultimate unity with heaven.
The great generals are not warlike. The great warriors do not get angry. Those who are good at defeating enemies do not engage them. Those who are good at managing people lower themselves. It is called the virtue of non-contention. It is called the power of managing people. It is called being harmonious with heaven, the ultimate principle of the ancients. So in this chapter, we're speaking about the virtue of non-contention, and this is one of the ultimate principles within Taoism, especially within the Tao Te Ching. If we look at the Tao Te Ching specifically as a text used for strategic purposes in our life, right? Like if we're looking at dealing with people, at dealing with society, and even in dealing with ourselves, we need to understand this principle of non-contention.
Yes. And Lao Tzu uses this example of being a soldier, being a fighter, and also being a winner, right? And that it's somewhat in a smaller scale or bigger scale that we are all striving for, right? But again, Lao Tzu re-emphasized through this chapter to become a good soldier, good fighter, good winner, and even an employer is to take the back step a little bit and follow the law of nature, law of Tao, so that you remove yourself from being aggressive and trying to win by force and try to fight with just pure violence and anger as well. But those things are, nowadays people might take it as something very virtuous. We see on the social media the people very aggressive on the comment and the post and this and that. But again, we know that's not the way to be. And Lao Tzu always mentions to follow the way of Tao, being more like a sage-like, right? Again, that softness always overcomes the force, right? So he's trying to emphasize through this chapter again.
Yeah, that's right. And so when I think about this chapter, I often think about sporting coaches when I read this chapter. Now, if we look at the male sporting arena, like you often will have a bunch of young men, in some sense, who are very young and untamable, but when you have a good coach, usually the coach leads the way and they become a fatherly type figure, almost a mentor. And they have to be, the best coaches have to be really skilled in this virtue of non-contention. Now, obviously to overcome the other team, and there are times when the coach needs to put their foot down, be aggressive maybe with the boys and whatnot. But a lot of the time, let's say 95% of the time, it's more of in this mentorship role of leading young men into battle, right? And Lao Tzu uses the war analogy here. So obviously the best leaders, and we can transfer that with coaches or what have you, are usually the ones who are the most peaceful and the most compassionate, actually. And they're usually the ones that actually don't want to go to war, right? And so they don't want to go to war, but if necessary, they know how to lead the way in a non-contentious way, right? And this comes back to Taoism following nature. So in Taoism, they use like the metaphor of a thunderstorm or lightning or what have you, right? And so there's an immense power in a thunderstorm, but a thunderstorm has zero emotions. It's kind of like the straw dogs. Everyone's treated impartially. There is no emotional attachment to any one person over the other. But because it has that tremendous power, in a very impartial manner, there is no hatred, no intentional violence towards someone or something else. Like in Taoism, if someone got struck by lightning, it would be, well, these things happen. It wasn't anything particular against that individual. And so that's how we also have to think as well. Like when we are following the virtue of non-compassion, we have to become our own thunderstorm, because we all have our own immense power and energy. But if it's, as you mentioned with social media, if it's kind of entangled with hatred and identity and, I hate this group over that group and so forth and so on, there's a lot of weakness in that way of thinking. There's actually, social media has created this cowardice in society where people have zero resilience and they speak from behind their screens and so forth and so on, right? But this chapter of the Tao Te Ching is saying that's a sign of weakness. You have to be your own thunderstorm. You have to be impartial to the world. And that's actually how you can lead other people. As you said, from behind.
Yes.
You don't really have to be out in front pointing your finger and carrying on and this and that. You can lead from behind in a very good way. And as I mentioned with coaches, often the best coaches are the ones who lead from behind. They guide from behind. And the players pick up on this, and they pick up on this energy, and they know the best course forward, so to speak.
Yes. Nowadays, that a lot of arguments that are happening on the social media and online world is somewhat in a level of what Lao Tzu is speaking of, that it's very kind of low level, right? And that people who are arguing through the comment after comment are who are just very, very engaged and invested into the conversation to become a winner in a very petty way, right?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Very almost childish-like, and they're very just aggressive, and they're very acting out of emotion all the time. Very opposite to the power of storm that you're talking about.
They've been radicalized by social media.
Yes,
They've become social media extremists.
That's right. Yeah, it's unfortunately it had become that way, and again, unfortunately, more and more people becoming that way. But that's a very, very low and childish level of even like a battlefield, if you want to use a metaphor. But in a way that the true sense of a sagely-like person to be in a battlefield is nothing actually to do with the battle physical sense, battle in the outside world. The true sense of battle is actually within ourselves, I think. And you used a very good example of a sporting competition, right? Especially professional environment. The great coaches coach the players. Of course, you do acknowledge who you are facing against, right? And you need to have a healthy sense of respect of opposition team, right? You need to have good respect towards the opposition team, like how good they are, what their strengths are, and this and that. But at the same time, you need to be very well aware of what they're going to go into, about to go into, the battlefield that they're going into. In the end of the day, the true sense of winning and true sense of victory is actually not coming from just focusing outward world, what they're facing to, like outwardly. It's more so happening within themselves. And the good coaches indicate that to the direction for players to see within themselves. Again, staying calm and stay resilient, always bring the best out of the people, all of us probably, right? In not just the sporting competition environment, even in our real life, right? Yep. Like if we are very reactive and angry and, and just the pointing finger out, blaming what's happening outside and or other people or certain situation, that's not going to solve any problem. No. We know that, right? We just want to emotionally release that angry feeling, right? But again, it can be like that. We all get angry. We all are humans, right? And we need to release those emotions when we bottle up. But that we know that that's not going to solve the problem. Actually, what's going to solve the problem is to remain calm, and yet how you manage that anger, right? And how you manage the anger is what's happening within ourselves. Yes. So that's something that we need to actually work on it first and foremost.
Yes. Well, the Taoist sage diffuses situations impartially. And that's the difference probably with, the modern social media climate, right? So they will encounter a situation, and because they have an impartial perspective of the world, they can diffuse the situation. This is like pure leadership, right? So they don't have a vested interest, or they don't have a bias towards one team or the other. Well, in the sporting environment, obviously there will be a bias there. But if we're talking about a Taoist sage and we're talking about leadership in battle and in war, you'd want to diffuse the situation impartially. And even if you want to transfer that over to, say, coaching a sporting team, it's better the coach doesn't get into any sort of petty arguments with the other coach leading up to the game, because usually when that happens, the coach who starts the argument, it usually goes awry for them, right? And we see this time and time again throughout all of history. And so it's better to have, like you said, more of a calm disposition when you're approaching the battlefield or you're approaching a sporting game. Or, Lao Tzu's often using extreme examples of going into war on the battlefield. So the best leaders are usually calm and collected. They have an impartial perspective. They actually don't want war. They'll do anything not to have war. But if it's necessary, they will still try and approach it from this virtue of non-contention. Like, let's try and get over these petty disagreements we have with each other, because war is not even a last resort. It shouldn't even be on the table of consideration, right? Harming some other human should not even be on the table of consideration. Sure, we can talk about our differences and so forth and so on. And sadly, in the modern world, we've softened, especially the younger generation, up with social media, that they can't even hear an alternative dialogue to whatever their indoctrination is, or they can't even listen to one word without getting triggered. So they wouldn't have survived in the 60s, let's say. And so you don't want to become a weak person like that. You want to, Lao Tzu is saying, follow this virtue of non-contention, because if you follow that virtue of non-contention, you can hear things that you probably disagree with, but it doesn't really trigger you because you come from an impartial perspective of reality. You don't have a bias towards this group or that group. The path of Taoism is the dissolution of the identity, which people sometimes don't understand, where modern social media culture, which is driven by tech companies and investment firms that don't have your best interests at heart, are centered on dividing humanity. So how do you divide humanity? You enhance identity. You don't decrease the identity, right? So you enhance all of these superficial differences that humans have. And Taoism is saying, no, that's not the answer to peace, obviously, and most Eastern spiritual traditions don't agree with that, obviously. And this is why we have this kind of path of non-contention. And you can transplant this over into Sanatana Dharma, where you have the tradition of Ahimsa, and Ahimsa doesn't just mean sort of non-violence, it means sort of non-harming. So not harming anyone and also not harming yourself. And so how do you do that? Well, you have to have a place of pure clarity, of impartiality. I'm not partial to this team or that team, this ideology or that ideology. I follow the path of no ideology. And so unfortunately, the social media culture is all about ideology. And so what happens when someone is all about ideology? They become radicalized and they can't see the forest for the trees. And that's just the fact of the matter.
Yes, the Ahimsa, the concept of non-violence or non-harming, is also not just to speak of the outward violence, like not hitting anyone, not harming anyone, like physically. It's also more like mentally, I think. Mentally, not having speaking of ideology and identity and things like that, having strong ideology and identity over someone else's is actually violent, and people don't see it that way, right?
No.
But that, because in the end that creates separation and division, and you act violently towards the people who think differently, right? So actually our mental ahimsa is actually what we really need to practice for ourselves, that we all have different ideas, right? That we have all different thoughts, but also everyone else does too. And that doesn't mean that you need to go crazy and become this extremist and reacting crazy. It doesn't mean that is a very violent way of thinking, very violent way of even being in a way, so that causing harm to other people. You may not bring a weapon out and then harming other people physically, but you are actually harming mentally, right? And that is, unfortunately, it's full of it on the social media platform. But we need to withdraw ourselves from that kind of headspace.
And it's also harming yourself more so than harming anyone else, because you're sort of internally splitting yourself. Whereas if you're a proper spiritual aspirant, a sincere spiritual aspirant, and you're someone who is invested in Taoism, say, for example, because we're speaking about Tao Te Ching, your perspective is oneness is the real reality, is the true reality. So all is Tao and Tao is all. And so if that's not your starting place, if you hear something or you see something and then you start this internal dialogue where there's that anger in that internal dialogue, you have to do the internal work to get over this aggressive internal dialogue that they're wrong and I'm right. And look, okay, there are divisive things in the world that are created by tech companies and investment firms and that to divide humanity. And you need to have a good BS detector for that. But still, as a spiritual aspirant, you don't want to also become too angry in the same sense about that, right? You need to be able to call BS when you see it. And that's just being authentic, right? There's nothing wrong per se about that. You don't want to get into this idea of good and bad, where a lot of people get into this good and bad dichotomy in sort of new age spirituality, but we're talking about traditional spirituality here. So it's there, you know, you're not going to get punished for having a good BS detector. So in the modern day, because it is more divisive and they are trying to control people and radicalize people, you need to see that, keep a distance from it, and also not submit to that. That's your responsibility as a sovereign Taoist. But at the same time, you don't want to then use that to kind of throw fuel on the fire in this internal dialogue you have. You still have to be working on yourself to have that impartial perspective so that you can see the world as it truly is. And look, sometimes these things just come and go. You know, there's situations in the world that come and they go, and we don't know all of us don't know what the world was like in the 1800s, for example. And look, there probably was a lot of stupid things going on at the same time. Maybe, you know, obviously not as much as there is today with the silly phones and the apps and whatnot. But you need to be constantly working on yourself, down-regulating your sense of identity in a world that is enhancing your identity. So if you are not going to be the spiritual oxygen for the world, you're only throwing more fuel on the fire. And so a spiritual aspirant, everyone who listens and watches our podcast or my channel, it's about providing that spiritual oxygen for a world that is basically starved of that oxygen.
That's right. Once you get into right and wrong argument, that means you are invested into whatever the topic of subject is, right? And you are taking the side, the partial point of view, right? That means you are entertaining that kind of argument. But again, at the end of the day, right or wrong doesn't mean anything, right? You need to have a healthy BS detector, and that helps your mental health, of course. But you don't have to go out and that is right or what's wrong and things like that, and try to impose that will on other people. That's not necessary. And just a healthy criticism over what's happening, and just keep that to yourself. And you need to keep the position of impartial perspective. Like you mentioned, the internal work is the first and foremost important thing. And in this kind of a very confusing world of today, you keep your healthy criticism to yourself, but you step back from that. You keep that distance, and you keep the impartial perspective, and you need to create that distance so that you are at a healthy distance from all these crazy things that are happening, and that's only going to benefit you. And then all you have is that space to work on yourself, right? And that is, again, that a lot always talks about, to have the sagely mind, the sagely perspective over the world.
Yeah, and as spiritual aspirants, to speak to what you were saying, is we're all leading from behind. We're not out at the front with our picket signs. You know, we all don't go to a protest as Taoists, for example, and protest the stupidity of the world or the clown show that the world has become. We lead from behind in being who we are, right? And if you want to make the right choices for the country that you live in or the government you want to support, go out and vote. You know, do simple things like that instead of going and fighting someone, right? Like, look, the votes can be rigged. There's no doubt about that. But go out and vote. If you think that a communist regime is in government and going to continue to stay in government or something of this matter, and you live in a democracy, your vote is needed, right? And so there's always the silent majority. But when we talk about spiritual aspirants, we are this silent minority, you know, the very small minority. And so for us, it's about keeping that impartiality, bringing that spiritual oxygen to the world, because we're living in a world that is really starving of spirituality in the modern day, basically. Right. Authentic spirituality.
Yes, and you mentioned that, like, election could be rigged and this and that. Yeah, it had happened in the past, but again, we cannot worry about that sort of things either. Like, we can only make decisions and making the right decisions within what's within our own control, right? Yeah. We cannot expect what outcome should be, right? Outcome is something out of our hands, and we can only hope for things to be fair and transparent. But if not, again, that's not the place where we need to be loud and, you know, like make a big trouble out of it. Yes, at times that are necessary, but not all the time, or not to move out of your way to influence the outcome or what's happening outside the world. You need to have a really like a right balance, right? But again, that right balance always comes from actually being very observant and being calm, actually. You cannot achieve that from being loud and aggressive and things like that.
Yeah. So no matter what happens, right, with all of this political nonsense, with all of this divisive ideologies in the modern world, all of this clown show that we might see, one thing always prevails: nature. And that's the Taoist view, and you've got to really stick to that, because that's the way it actually is. And that nature is flowing through you, through the spiritual aspirant, through the person who has impartial eyes. No matter what the world tells you, no matter what the politicians are doing, how they're fighting each other, all of these people enhancing their identity, then fighting each other in this divisive ideological war, nature prevails, and it will always prevail. And so that naturalness is within all of us as human beings. It's just a bit confused at the moment because of these overarching entities that are trying to indoctrinate and transform the way people think. But what will happen eventually? Nature will prevail. So guys, we hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you guys next time.